Imagine you cannot move, not because you are restrained, not because you are asleep, but because your body has consumed itself, every reserve of fat, every ounce of muscle memory, every drop of water. And what remains is just enough biology to keep your eyes open and your lungs working. Barely. The sun has been punishing you for 10 days straight. Your lips split open 4 days ago. Your tongue is so swollen you can no longer form words. The wood beneath you has been soaked in salt water so long it no longer feels like wood. It feels like the ocean itself, slowly pulling you under. Around you, on this crude, half-submerged platform of lashed timber, are the last 15 survivors of what was once 147 human beings. 132 people died on that raft. Some drowned, some died of thirst, some were murdered, thrown overboard by the men standing next to them, men they had once called comrades. And some were eaten. This is not just a shipwreck story. This is what happens when elite arrogance meets the merciless indifference of the sea. This is what happens when a government would rather bury the dead twice than admit the truth. And this painting you may have seen in a museum without knowing what you were really looking at. This is how one artist refused to let them get away with it. This is the story of the Raft of the Medusa. The year is 1816. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had consumed Europe like a fire for 15 years, is finally gone, exiled on a rock in the South Atlantic. And in his place, the Bourbon monarchy has been restored to power in France, as if the revolution and all that blood had simply been a bad dream. The new king is Louis XVIII, a man of immense girth and ancient prejudice. And like all insecure rulers, he fills the positions of power not with people who are competent, but with people who are loyal, people from the right families, with the right titles, with the right amount of money, and the right amount of deference toward him. Which is how Viscount Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix came to stand on the quarterdeck of the Medusa, the pride of the French Navy, a brand-new 40-gun frigate, as its captain. Despite not having sailed in 25 years. Despite having spent most of those years as an émigré, hiding from the revolution in England. Despite the fact that the experienced officers under his command, men who had actually served at sea, regarded him with barely concealed contempt. He had connections. He had a title. He had the king's favor. In 1816, France, that was apparently enough to command 400 lives on the open Atlantic. The mission itself seemed simple. France had just recovered the colony of Senegal from the British, and the Medusa was to lead a small convoy of ships to deliver the new French governor and a complement of soldiers and settlers. The journey was roughly 2,700 miles. For an experienced captain, a routine voyage. For Chaumareix, it would become the worst maritime disaster in French history. His first act of incompetence came within days of departure. Rather than taking the established, deeper water route used by virtually every experienced navigator in the Atlantic, Chaumareix chose a course that took the Medusa closer to the African coast, a coast notorious for its hidden sandbars and shallow banks. Why? Partly to save time, partly because a self-styled navigator on board, a man with no official rank named Richefort, who had somehow talked his way into Chaumareix's confidence, convinced him it was the better path. His experienced officers objected, loudly, repeatedly. Chaumareix ignored them. On the morning of July 2, 1816, the Medusa struck the Arguin Bank, a treacherous shoal off the coast of present-day Mauritania, and ran hard aground. The impact shuddered through the hull. The ship listed. Water began seeping in through the straining timbers. For 3 days, they tried everything, jettisoning cannons, food, supplies, to refloat the hull. Nothing worked. The Medusa was stuck fast, and the sea was beginning to tear her apart. It was time to abandon ship. Here is where the class structure of 1816 France became a death sentence. There were approximately 400 people on board the Medusa. There were 6 lifeboats. Do the math. The math is brutal. Even filled to capacity, the boats could carry fewer than 250 people, which meant that 150 souls, the poorest soldiers, the enlisted sailors, the civilian settlers of the lowest rank, were not going to fit. Someone had the idea to build a raft. In fairness, this was not an unreasonable idea. A large, sturdy raft could carry the overflow passengers, and the lifeboats would tow it to shore, to the Senegalese coast, roughly 60 miles away. It was not comfortable, it was not safe, but it was survivable, in theory. 147 people climbed onto that raft. Among them, soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, a handful of women, and a 12-year-old boy. They were given 60 pounds of ship's biscuit, already softened to pulp by the seawater, 25 pounds of lard, 6 barrels of water, and a few casks of wine. Provisions calculated, generously, for a 2-day voyage to shore. The 6 lifeboats took up their tow ropes. Captain Chaumares himself climbed into a boat, not to command the raft, not to supervise the rescue, but to save himself. The governor, the senior officers, the passengers of rank, they were all safely seated in the lifeboats. The raft carried the expendable ones. At first the convoy moved, slowly, awkwardly, but it moved. The raft was heavy, unwieldy, dragging against the current. The men in the boats complained that it was slowing them down. And then, somewhere in the afternoon of July 5, 1816, a decision was made. The order was given to cut the tow ropes. July 5, 1816, 14 miles from the Arguin Bank. Some accounts say Chaumares gave the order directly. Others say it was a collective decision among the boat commanders, who told themselves it was for the safety of everyone, that a raft that couldn't keep up was better left behind, to be recovered later. But there was no later. There was no plan to come back. The men in the boats knew it, and the men on the raft, watching in stunned, uncomprehending silence as the ropes went slack and the boats began to pull away. They knew it too. Someone screamed. Then everyone screamed. Soldiers waded into the chest-deep water, pulling at ropes that were no longer taut. Men on the raft sobbed or fell silent, or stood with an expression that survivors would later describe as beyond terror. They had crossed from bad luck into something deliberate. They had been left behind to die. 147 people. No navigation, no plan, no rescue coming. Night was falling, and the Atlantic Ocean, the largest body of water on the face of the earth, was about to remind them exactly how small they were. The first night broke them in a way the sea itself could not. Picture the geometry of this. 65 feet of rough-hewn timber, packed with nearly 150 human bodies. There is no room to sit comfortably. There is no room to lie down. The platform is half submerged. Water surges over the boards with every swell, soaking the men to the waist. Those near the edges hold on to ropes and each other. Those in the center are crushed from all sides. The air smells of fear, of unwashed bodies, of the brine the raft is steadily drinking. Then the Atlantic showed them it wasn't finished with them yet. A squall hit in the early hours, waves crashing over the raft, the structure groaning and flexing beneath their weight. In the chaos and the dark, in the screaming confusion of men losing their grip, 20 people were washed into the sea. They were simply gone. No recovery was possible. In the darkness, no one even knew who they were until morning, when the head count came up short. By the second night, with the body count rising and any hope of rescue still invisible on the horizon, the social contract on the raft began to dissolve. Men who had been soldiers, trained, disciplined, obedient, began to crack. Someone had brought wine, several casks of it. On an empty stomach, beneath the psychic weight of total despair, the wine hit like a sledgehammer. The mutinies began. Not a single organized uprising, but eruptions, bursts of violent, drunken fury, erupting and collapsing again and again through the long nights. Groups of soldiers decided they were going to end it, to smash the raft apart and drown everyone rather than face this slow agony. The officers fought them back with swords and bayonets. The raft became a battlefield, 30 feet long and shin-deep in seawater, with men stabbing and strangling and clubbing each other in the dark. By the morning of day 4, another 40 people were dead, some drowned, some killed in the fighting, some simply lost to the sea in the confusion. The survivors huddled in exhausted clusters, staring at each other across a platform now noticeably less crowded, trying to comprehend what they had done and what had been done to them. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from thirst in salt water. You are surrounded by liquid, the ocean is infinite, it is beneath you, it is soaking through your clothes, and yet you cannot drink a drop of it. Salt water doesn't hydrate you. It accelerates dehydration, draws moisture from your cells, drives your kidneys into overdrive. The brain, starved of water, begins to shut down its non-essential functions first. Short-term memory goes, then the ability to accurately perceive time, then the boundary between what is real and what the desperate mind manufactures to protect itself. Hallucinations were reported by virtually every survivor. Some men saw rescue ships on the horizon and dove into the ocean to swim toward them, ships that were not there. Some held entire conversations with dead family members standing at the edge of the raft. One man, a young soldier, reportedly laughed without stopping for the better part of a day before he went quiet. And then the biscuit ran out. And then the water barrels were empty. There was, of course, the ocean. And there was the rain when it came. Men tipping their heads back, mouths open, wringing whatever they could from their clothes. And there was the flesh of the fish they occasionally caught with their bare hands. Raw flesh. The flesh of creatures they could barely see in the blood-warm water around them. But human survival is extraordinarily, terrifyingly adaptable. And as the bodies of the dead accumulated on the raft, those who had died of thirst, of injury, of madness, the living faced a question that no human being should ever have to answer outside of a philosophy seminar. The first time a survivor's account mentions cannibalism is on approximately day 6 or 7. The accounts are careful about this, hedged in euphemism by men who spent the rest of their lives unable to fully speak what they had witnessed or done. But the medical testimony gathered after the rescue is unambiguous. Bones were found on the raft, human bones with cut marks on them. Understand the psychological architecture of this decision. These were not monsters. These were men, ordinary men, who had been pushed past the absolute limit of what the human body and mind can endure. They crossed a line that every culture in the history of the world defines as the ultimate taboo, not because they had abandoned their humanity, but because the will to survive is the oldest, most fundamental program written into every cell of a living body. Taboo research in psychology tells us that moral revulsion, the visceral wrongness we feel toward certain acts, doesn't disappear in survival situations. It remains. The survivors who ate the dead did not feel nothing. They felt everything. The psychological cost was paid in full over the weeks and months and years that followed, in nightmares and silence, and the inability to ever be the person they had been before the raft. Surgeon Henri Savigny, one of the men who would survive and later testify, described it not as a decision at all, but as the moment the body simply took over and the mind retreated somewhere it could not watch what was happening. It was, he wrote, an act of the animal, not the man. By day 9, there were approximately 30 survivors remaining on the raft. The provisions, whatever remained, could sustain perhaps 15 people for a few more days. Every survivor account acknowledges what happened next, and every one of them describes it differently. Some call it a mercy, some call it a military decision, some call it murder. The stronger survivors, the officers, the healthiest of the soldiers, made a calculation. 15 people might survive until rescue. 30 people would not. The wounded and the dying, those who could not stand, could not work the raft, could not contribute to their own survival, were put into the sea. Not through violence exactly, or not only through violence. Some were simply too weak to resist being moved to the edge of the raft. Some were already unconscious. Some may have agreed. The survivors who spoke later used the word consensus. But consensus requires the ability to consent, and those who were thrown overboard were in no condition to consent to anything. This is the darkest mathematics of survival. Not evil as a malevolent choice, but evil as arithmetic, as the cold logic of a mind that has stripped everything away except the one biological imperative. Do not stop existing. Philosophers call it lifeboat ethics. Anyone who has actually been in a lifeboat or on a raft will tell you that it is not a thought experiment. When day 13 ended, 15 people remained alive on the raft of the Medusa. They had no water and almost no food. They had been at sea for nearly 2 weeks. They had witnessed or participated in acts that no surviving civilization had ever decided were permissible. They were, by every clinical measure, barely conscious. And they waited. 15 people, no water, no hope, or so they believed. What they did not know was that a ship had already been looking for them, and that the rescue was not the end of this story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. On day 15, July 17, 1816, the brig Argus appeared on the horizon. It had actually been in the area before, had come close enough to the raft's position on day 13 to theoretically have spotted it, and had not. Whether this was genuine navigational error or something more deliberate was never definitively proven, and the question haunted the survivors. But on the morning of the 17th, the Argus's lookout finally spotted what appeared to be a piece of wreckage, and the captain altered course to investigate. What they found aboard the raft defied description. 15 people alive, barely. Several were unable to stand. Some had to be physically lifted into the rescue boat. Their skin was burned black by 2 weeks of equatorial sun. Their lips were cracked to the bone. Several showed signs of injuries consistent with the violence that had taken place on board. All showed signs of extreme starvation. And the raft itself, the physical evidence of what had happened there, was unmistakable. The survivors were brought to St. Louis, Senegal. They received medical care. Some of them recovered physically within weeks. None of them ever fully recovered psychologically. Now, here is where the story pivots. Because from the moment those 15 people set foot back on dry land, the Bourbon government of France faced a catastrophic problem. The problem was this. The captain they had appointed, the captain who had run a ship aground through criminal incompetence, who had then abandoned over 100 of his passengers to die, was a nobleman, a man of the court, a man whose appointment reflected the personal judgment of King Louis XVIII himself. The French press was already circling. Word had gotten back to Paris. There were sailors and soldiers back in France who had been on the convoy ships that had sailed away, and not all of them were willing to stay quiet. And there were now 15 survivors. 15 people who had been on the raft. 15 witnesses. The government's response was not to investigate, punish, and reform. The government's response was to suppress. Survivors were discouraged from speaking publicly. The official naval inquiry into the wreck was conducted quietly, its findings sealed. The newspapers that pushed the story were subjected to pressure. Chaumareys was eventually court-martialed years later, and his sentence was 3 years in prison, later suspended. 3 years for 132 deaths, suspended. The message was clear. The hierarchy of the Bourbon Restoration was more important than the truth. The men and women who had died on the raft had been, in the eyes of the state, expendable when they were alive. And they remained expendable in death, their story to be filed, buried, and forgotten. What the government did not count on was a young surgeon named Henri Savigny, and what they truly did not count on was a 25-year-old painter named Théodore Géricault, who had not been on the raft, but who was about to make the world understand what had happened there as if he had. Theodore Géricault was not a political activist. He was not a journalist or a lawyer or a reformer. He was a painter, a young, technically extraordinary painter who had grown up in the tradition of French academic art, large-scale history paintings of battles and mythological scenes. He was the kind of artist who, in another era, might have spent his career painting allegories of victory for kings. But the story of the Medusa enraged him, not in a distant intellectual way, in a consuming, obsessive, physical way. He read everything he could find, the survivor accounts, the medical testimony, the suppressed inquiry reports. He sought out Henri Savigny and another survivor, geographer Alexandre Correard, and interviewed them at length in sessions that reportedly left all three men shaken. He visited hospitals to sketch patients in extremis, to understand what real clinical suffering looks like in the human body, not the theatrical suffering of academic painting. He had a scale model of the Raft built in his studio. He posed models on it, actual people, standing in the positions he was working out on canvas. He studied the physics of the ocean, the angle of the sun, the texture of waterlogged wood. He treated the painting as a documentary project with the rigor of a scientist and the vision of an artist who understood that the difference between a painting that moves people and a painting that changes history is the difference between making someone feel a thing and making them unable to look away. He worked on it for 18 months. He lost 20 pounds during the painting. He had his head shaved so that he could not leave the studio, a self-imposed confinement to match, in its way, the confinement of the men on the raft. He understood somehow that to make this painting true, he had to put himself inside the story as completely as he could. The finished canvas was enormous, 16 feet tall, nearly 24 feet wide. It depicted the moment on day 13 when the survivors first spotted the Argus in the distance, the moment of agonized, frantic hope, before they knew whether they had been seen. The composition was a pyramid, built from the dead at its base to the living at its apex, the whole structure straining toward the horizon. The colors were the colors of real suffering: gray-green sea, bone-white skin, the livid darkness of bruised and burned flesh. There was nothing heroic about it. There was nothing allegorical. There was no mythology. There was only the truth, rendered at a scale impossible to ignore. When the painting was shown at the Paris Salon of 1819, the Bourbon government's worst nightmare materialized in real time. The public gathered in front of it and could not look away. Critics who wanted to dismiss it as sensationalist found themselves unable to argue with what they were seeing. Newspapers that had been cautious about the Medusa story, cautious about government pressure, suddenly had permission to cover it because the painting had already made it a public conversation. Chaumares was finally put on trial. His sentence, though absurdly lenient, at least put the facts of the case into the official record. The survivors, Savigny and Correard, published their account, which became an immediate bestseller. The government had tried to bury this story, and a 25-year-old painter had dug it back up with a brush. 200 years later, the Raft of the Medusa hangs in the Louvre. People stand in front of it every day: tourists, art students, ordinary people who wandered in from the Paris street. Most of them know something about it. Most of them understand, in a general way, that it depicts a disaster, a tragedy, something terrible that happened at sea. Very few of them can hold in their minds, while standing in a climate-controlled museum, the full reality of what that painting documents. The 30 days of sun, the mutinies in the dark, the bones with cut marks on them, the 15 people who were quietly removed from the edge of a floating platform so that 15 others could survive. We want to believe that the horror of the Medusa is historical, safely archived in the past, separated from us by 2 centuries and the reassuring distance of a museum wall. But the architecture of that disaster was not unique to 1816. A leader appointed for his connections rather than his competence. An institution protecting itself instead of the people depending on it. The powerful boarding the lifeboats first, the powerless pushed to the periphery and cut loose. Those dynamics are not historical. They are contemporary. They repeat in corporate boardrooms and government ministries and the quarterdeck of every institution that has ever chosen loyalty over ability and image over truth. What Jericho understood, and what the Bourbon government most feared, was that a story told truthfully is the one thing no cover-up can permanently silence. The survivors wanted to survive the raft. The painter wanted to survive the silence. Both, in their own way, succeeded. 132 people went into the Atlantic Ocean on that raft and did not come back. Their names were never inscribed anywhere official. No monument was built. The government that abandoned them was more interested in the painting than in the people who inspired it. Interested, that is, in destroying it. But here it is. Still here. Still 24 feet wide, still 16 feet tall, still depicting the exact moment when 15 human beings, ragged, burned, half-mad,